Welcome to the BOGART Effect, a wealthy wisdom podcast. The following BOGART Effect podcast is intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from BOGART or another investment professional. Please see important disclosure information at the end of the presentation. Good morning. Welcome to the BOGART Effect. Thanks for taking some time. Today I've got Grayson with me, and we're going to be talking about savings outside of retirement accounts. Grayson, thanks for joining this morning.
Happy to be here.
So, this is something that at BOGART Wealth, I would say it's very near and dear to our hearts when we talk about savings, because the fact of the matter is you need to have a financial plan. And when we look at Americans, we're seeing where less than 4% of Americans have over $1 million of investable assets accumulated. Less than 1% of Americans have over $5 million of investable assets accumulated. At a very high level, I would summarize it as people are undersaved and they're not proactively thinking about their financial well-being. And this is a financial literacy conversation today primarily. But even worse than that, the estimates are that 1 in 4 Americans have less than $10,000 saved, which, I mean, that statistic is absolutely mind-boggling to me. Yeah. So as we talk about savings outside of retirement accounts, I think a lot of people naturally assume safer retirement, which would typically mean their employer retirement plans. But they don't necessarily have the educational insight or knowledge around what are the other options. So to start this, why don't we talk about the 3 different types of accounts at a really high level, and then we'll start drilling in if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, so the 3 different types of accounts that we typically see or we have is the non-qualified, qualified, and Roth assets.
So just to summarize these, a non-qualified account would be brokerage accounts, checking accounts, money markets accounts. The pros there are that you're able to have that money accessible at any point in time. I would say the cons there are you pay tax on interest, you pay tax on dividends, you pay tax on capital gains. I might even add in the conversation on a pro for brokerage accounts or non-qualified accounts is there's no age restrictions of when you can get to those monies. So that's probably the biggest advantage there. That said, we typically see that being the last place that people accumulate wealth because in order to put it in there, you had to work, you had to live, which would include retirement savings or other savings, and then you can save into non-qualified accounts. And yeah, that's typically the hardest part of this conversation. So then when we pivot to talk about qualified accounts, well, qualified accounts are usually retirement plans at your employer, 401ks, 403bs, 457s, SEP IRAs. Those are before tax monies we put in. They grow completely tax deferred. When you take the money out, you pay ordinary income. So the main benefit there is you get that tax deferred growth. And I would also say that you're also getting a tax deduction typically when you're at the highest marginal tax brackets that you're going to be in. The big negative, I would say, is the ordinary income component when you pull it out. And then in some instances, it does impact a lot of our customer base, but in some instances, when they hit the age of required minimum distributions, which is age 73 or age 75, they now have to take out what are called required minimum distributions, which is a predictated percentage of those accounts. And dependent upon what you're spending relative to the level of assets, that actually can be relatively let's just say punitive. And then the third bucket is these Roth accounts. And I also see here that a lot of misconceptions around Roth accounts is everyone feels like they got to get everything in a Roth. Well, that may or may not be the case. And we've actually done several podcasts and webinars around why saving everything in a Roth might not be the best conduit. But with Roths, you're putting money in on an after-tax basis. It grows completely tax-free as long as you turn the age of 59 and a half. The money's been in there for 5 years. You get to take the money out and all of the gain completely tax-free as well. And Roths do not have those required minimum distributions. The hard part with Roths, though, is that to get it in, you have to put it on an after-tax basis. So what we typically recommend with Roths is load them up when you're in low brackets, or load them up when you have a lot of excess tax savings capability, and you're later on in life after you've already maxed out your pre-tax. We have content just on this, but again, in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about savings outside of retirement accounts. So when we say that, it's going to be those non-qualified accounts. But I felt like we had to set the stage of what is a qualified and what is a Roth in order to be able to focus solely on the non-qualifieds. So Grayson, let's dive into what are non-qualified accounts. What are the different types, structures, benefits, et cetera?
Sure. Yeah. So a couple of examples of the non-qualified accounts, starting with the checking and savings accounts. These are accounts that I'd say most people have, most people are familiar with. They're liquid. They're FDIC insured, meaning if your bank happens to go under, that your money's protected up to certain limits. And there's little to no interest on these accounts typically.
There's none.
It's like 0.01.
It's none.
So the next step up from there would probably be a money market or a high yield savings account. These accounts are liquid as well, offer a little bit higher interest. I'd say probably around 3.5 to 4% right now.
Depending on which ones, and there are different types of money markets as well. Because like, for example, our customer base primarily is at Schwab. We use money market conduits at Schwab, which is actually a brokerage money market. Right now we're getting about 4.2 to 4.3%. But there's ones that are at banks, like where they have money market programs. To your point, they're still FDIC insured. They're getting 3.5. Some are up as high as 4%.
Yep.
A lot of banks, just while we're on it, they'd like to use those money markets with teaser rates. Like they'll guarantee the rate for a period of time, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And then immediately, because they want the assets there, and then immediately as that time duration expires, they then bring that rate down. Just something to be aware of.
Yep. And then building off of that, there's also brokerage accounts. It's a versatile investment account, has flexible withdrawals and kind of tax planning strategies. And then aside from those, there's kind of some more niche non-qualified savings we can talk about, like your HSAs that are going to cover qualified medical expenses. You're able
what's an HSA mean?
Health savings account. You're able to invest the money in your savings, in your health savings account. It's a triple tax benefit. You get a tax deduction on the way in, tax-free growth, and then tax-free withdrawals as long as it's for a qualified medical expense. And I'd say one more non-qualified, more niche account would be a 529 account. I think most people would be familiar with this, but that's a college savings account for your children.
Yep. Bingo. And so from my perspective, this whole conversation about where to save comes back to the needs that an individual has. And it's interesting because as you talk to a client, you can very quickly tell more or less where their pain point is or where the priority is right now. Like, for example, most of our clients that are entering or near retirement, for them, the primary impetus is around saving for retirement. Whereas if we talk to someone that's like a Gen Z, well, for them, it's probably building the emergency fund, saving for a car, saving for a house. And just because of what that prioritization is, that's going to naturally save not only the how and the where. So let's talk a little bit about time horizons, probably some goal setting associated with how to save and where to save.
Yeah, and I'd say it's important, like you said, everybody's goals and needs are different, but I think that we can kind of break it down to a similar structure for everybody, which would be short-term, intermediate term, and long-term goals. But those goals themselves are going to be different for everybody. So, for somebody like myself, Gen Z, the short-term goals are going to be, like you said, saving to an emergency fund. Typically looking for 3 to 6 months of living expenses in the emergency fund.
So, that's a great point. I think especially when you're fresh out of college, I'm going to go back, it's not that long ago, but it was long enough. When you're fresh out of school, you don't have discretionary savings, right? Like everything is chipping away at the same dollars. And I do think that it really does depend, as you're filling these respective buckets, not only what your income stability is, but it also depends, again, on this time horizon. And why I say it that way is simply because when I started in the industry, I was in a sales role and I had tremendous income variability. By the way, this bit me a couple times, right? Where I would have a really good quarter and that kind of inherently naturally increased standard of living a little bit, right? And then all of a sudden I'd have 2 bad quarters. And, it's like, oh my gosh, so the reason I'm saying it that way is for a younger employee or individual coming out of school, if they have a high level of predictability and stability of their job, their income source, then I might draw that number down to the 3 months of expenses. But if you're in a sales role, like a realtor, for example, I'm actually going to push you into like 12 months of savings in those really liquid, easily accessible types of buckets, because times get tough. And I think knowing that, yes, there's going to be that proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, but also knowing that you're going to have lumpiness associated with income depending upon the type of job you have. That naturally should impact what goes into the savings for an emergency fund or that shorter duration. By the way, I'm talking specifically more around that money market bucket. Checking accounts, I don't typically like to see huge checking accounts. Maybe 1.5 months worth of expenses that are in the actual, call it, operating checking account. And then we have that money market bucket that's directly linked to the checking account that, as I was just saying, dependent upon the stability of your income, could absolutely, fluctuate there. Then we start talking about what are the other type, niche nuances or other savings conduits outside of that.
Well, I would also say on the money market, I think that kind of your personal life comes into play a little bit, because for somebody that's, living with their spouse, 2 incomes, maybe you can have 3 months, be on the 3-month side of things, because what are the odds that both of you lose your
100%.
jobs? And you're going to have one income still going, most likely, even if one loses the job. Whereas 6 months, if you're single, living alone, you're solely dependent on one income. You probably want to have a little bit more of a buffer there.
Bingo. I like that point. That's a good comment. The overarching theme as we started, it comes back to having a plan, and that's precisely that point.
Absolutely.
Let's get in a little bit on some of those intermediate term goals. And to me, intermediate really is anything after a year. And it could be as long as 10 years. But this is typically saving for a house, saving for cars, saving for vacations, renovations, pool, whatever you want to do for the house. That to me is absolutely where we're using brokerage accounts. And then it becomes a conversation of comfort level with risk. And the reason that we want to use a brokerage account is because that is the conduit that we can get that money pretty darn quick, right? I mean, yes, the big risk I see with it is you're subjected to whatever the market's doing. So as we've used brokerage accounts, for example, for something that might be, let's just say 3 years away, but then we start getting closer and closer and closer to that 3-year target point, then we should start throttling the risk down with that. Like, for example, I have a client I was working with recently. They're getting ready to buy a new house. Well, okay, that was something that we started planning for 7 years ago. And here we are, like it's going to happen any day. And so because it's going to happen any day, and obviously with the amount of volatility that we're having in the markets right now, we're throttling that risk back. And naturally, I think should, because we want to remove emotion from this process. We don't want the amplitude or to take the risk associated with not knowing that the money that we're going to need is actually there along the way. And then simultaneously, I would say it also comes down to just making a savvy financial decision dependent upon the time that you need it. Anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'd say that, I've seen a couple of situations where maybe there's the temptation to squeeze that extra couple of percent out of the returns if you want to stay invested in equities as you're approaching your goal. But it really comes down to a decision of, is that extra few percentage, return worth giving up the goal of, say, buying your house? Well,
and how flexible is said goal? I'm going to go the other way right now because I had let my cash position, my money market and savings position get up a little bit. And because of the market correction, now, I'll admit, my wife has things earmarked for that. I'm not going to necessarily say my priority is as high as hers on said earmarking. So I actually opportunistically, as the market's corrected, went ahead and introduced some risk to it. Now, I understand I might not keep it there long term, or I might just focus on saving to get it back up to where it was for said goal. But the reality of it is there can be some flexibility within that intermediate tranche. The one thing that I will say, though, is, and this, especially when market volatility amplifies, it's very important to remove emotion. And what I mean by that is, if your time horizon hasn't changed, and your risk profile have not changed, your investment strategy should not change. Now, that does not mean that we don't change the vehicles that we're invested in, because there are reasons to reduce risk within certain assets and increase risk within other assets. But ultimately, we shouldn't be, let's just say, market's down 9% like it was a couple weeks ago, all of a sudden we're going to cash. Like, that's not a good investment move. And frankly, who knows definitively what the market environment's going to do right now. April is actually turned out to not be that bad of a month. I mean, as volatile as it was, don't get me wrong, it was down, but it was more in line with, we would say, normal volatility in a market environment. even though it had crazy days of up and down. But if you look at it on a 30-day period of time, it actually wasn't, that out of the realm of, and if somebody made an emotional decision on those bad days, especially for something that's like, I have line of sight, I need to buy this house, or I need to buy this, or I need to buy that, and they emotionally respond to that, well, they've just locked in an irreversible loss, right? So volatility is one of those things where we have to have it in a market environment. It is very, very normal. If anything, 2023 and 2024 were anomalies of years because we didn't have a lot of volatility, and 2025 is kind of making up for that. Obviously, we've got an administration that's driving a lot of that, but candidly, I tell you, when we talk about periods of insane volatility, there's always a catalyst. It's COVID, it's the Fed, it's geopolitical. It's actually more common. 83% of years have market fluctuations intra-year over 10%. than it is to not have that level of volatility. So this has just been an important reminder, but coming back to your goals and setting the priority, do not get emotional because of volatility in the markets. But this is also why I see the value in an advisor, simply because not only do we help keep emotions in check, but at the same time too, we're aligning the goals with the investment thesis associated with each of those respective buckets. And that's why typically as we're engaging with our clients, we're having the conversation of, when are we going to need this money? Like, how are cash flows? When are we going to need the funds? What's coming up on the horizon? We've got quarterly estimated tax payments. We're going to need some liquidity for that, et cetera. And we're adjusting the portfolio mix along the way. Now, admittedly, this is also an environment, coming back to specifically savings outside of, this is also an environment where we see people changing spending habits simply because, okay, portfolio's down, maybe I'm going to spend a little less. That's actually, if it's something you can do, that's great. But that's not something that we're preaching on them, right? Like, we don't want them to have to be in a position where they feel that way, but some do. And if they do, that's less they're drawing on the portfolio, which makes the portfolios recover faster when we actually get the better days.
Absolutely. So
let's talk a little bit about the long-term buckets now. And this is where I come back to that comment about everything's chipping away at the same dollars. And I'll make a generalization on the generations, right? But like, when I was coming out of school, retirement savings was not a high priority for me. It was, again, saving for the rainy day fund, saving for a house, saving for cars, keeping up with the Joneses, like whatever else you want to describe it as. And now, fortunately, I'd say occupationally, I did it, but I find it very amazing to me how most kids coming out of school, they don't believe in saving for retirement, or they don't place that as a high priority.
Well, it's so far off.
Yeah, it's not real.
It's not a problem, James.
Yeah, when the reality of it is that retirement savings should be the first thing that we're saving for when you come out of school, because of time value of money. Absolutely. And getting it started. But I also would say that we also want to make sure that we're maxing out where there's the call it free money, right? Like, I've looked at retirement plans that are giving you a 3%, 5%, 6%. Like, that's free money. In order to get it, you got to put some years in, right? But like, you want to raise? Like, it always baffles me when someone's not contributing to a retirement plan, because right off the bat, that's like the free money. Everything else outside of that then becomes the conversation we're having today, which is the efficiencies, optimizations, how to save, where to save, and it needs to directly align with the goals. Once we could get back to this place of long-term, and we're starting to think about situationally, like, what is very important to you versus what's important to me. Like, for example, you don't have kids yet. So saving for a 529 is not a high priority for you. I imagine when you do, it will be. But as you and I were talking before we got on the podcast, I have kids in college savings right now, right? So like, I'm trying to figure out how to optimize what's the amount and what level of savings do I want to be doing? Do I want to do a little bit more since the market's down right now? Like, having that conversation, and that falls into the long-term bucket. I have an 8-year-old, I have a 6-year-old, and I have a 2-year-old. Like,
and there's some gift tax complications that come into play with this too, with the 529s. There's a yearly amount that you can give to people, but then there's also the idea of front loading.
So with 529s, you can actually put 5 years of the annual gift threshold in all at once if you're in that position to be able to do it. But you have to look at, in aggregate, what else you're giving your kids. So it kind of becomes a little bit of a difficult math equation. And I think it really comes down to, again, that just having a plan, aligning the goals. But I still think that coming back to kind of how I introduced the conversation earlier, a lot of people think, they need to save everything in a Roth. And candidly, that's just not necessarily the right mechanism dependent upon what your respective goals are. And so our hope today is to really educate on what those other options are. In that long-term bucket, it still absolutely can be brokerage, because when you're even thinking about retirement savings, if one of your goals is to retire before you turn 59 and a half, well, if that, and by the way, at age 59 and a half, there's if anything prior to that, there's a 10% penalty to pull money out of a retirement account. There are some different nuances that we could theoretically access it beforehand, but the reality of it is that's not the most advantageous way. So if your goal is to retire before the age of 59 and a half, we really need to be building that into your plan as early as we possibly can, which would include having brokerage accounts and having non-qualified savings in there so that money's ready to go. We're set. Like, we have full visibility on how your cash flows are going to be derived before that age milestone, right? Mm-hmm. And that typically would be in this longer term bucket, which theoretically means initially, at least when we start saving for that type of goal, let's just say you're in your 30s or 40s. Well, okay, great. We could take a lot of risks then. But now, like, for example, I've got a guy, one of our clients just turned 55, and the conversation is he wants to retire in the next year and a half. Okay, well, because of that, naturally, we're throttling that risk back because the time horizon has adjusted. And we have full visibility. To your point earlier, no, we don't want to eke out a couple more percentage points. Like, the consequence of going backwards is far more excessive than the consequences of making more for him. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, I think it's really important to align the investments with the respective buckets. Mm-hmm. All right, so we've talked about the 3-bucket approach, specifically short-term, intermediate, and long-term. Grayson, why don't we talk a little bit about how it evolves over time? Sure. We typically describe wealth creation or wealth accumulation as accumulators, and then you hit the life event, usually it's retirement, of deaccumulation. So how are they going to change as that happens?
Yeah, well, I can speak from personal experience, being an accumulator myself a few years out of college. The 3 buckets for short, intermediate, and long-term are kind of, we touched on it earlier, having that short-term kind of accessible cash for any kind of emergencies that might come up. The intermediate term is those brokerage accounts, saving for cars, saving for a home purchase, starting a business, something like that. And then the long-term will be the retirement accounts. But as you touched on, James, as time evolves, I want to kind of lean on you for some advice on, I have my perspective of being, kind of new to the industry, fresh out of college. How did these strategies evolve over time in your 30s, 40s, 50s?
You're not fresh out of college anymore.
it feels like
you can't hold that forever. They do change. And I do think that it comes back to the priorities that you as an individual or household have. And for example, I mentioned my kids. Well, all of a sudden that was a new goal that got created that then became, not only are kids a cash flow drain, but then saving for their education also is a cash flow drain, right? So that's an example of, now I had a new non-qualified account that I was then making monthly contributions or annual contributions into just to be able to accomplish that goal. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where, coming back to having that plan and understanding, goals-based planning is very, very important. It can't just be around cash flows. It has to be understanding where is the prioritization of said goal, because they will evolve over time. What I typically, especially I start meeting someone who's fresh out of college, I have to impose really what my perspective is, which, candidly is, they need to be prioritizing retirement savings first. I come back to everybody's chipping away at that same dollar, right? And it's hard because you want to still have a life. We jokingly will say the financial planner and us will have you work till you're 80, you die at 81, the plan's going to work great. But we'll also have you save every dollar you make and leave nothing left to live. And, that's not life, right? Mm-hmm. So making sure that we're aligning goals. And I'll also give another one. I know you and I personally have talked about this, but as I got married, everything changed. And I mean that in the most loving way, but we went from, I would almost just say selfishly, the things that were important to me, to now having a partner, to making sure that I was aligning there. And that then adjusted what needed to be saved. And then we made the decision for my wife to not have to work any longer. That was a goal that was important to us, right? So that was one where I would say that knowing the situation of each respective household, and especially as you're getting married, that's a pivotal life one. Then you have kids, there's another pivotal life one. Inheritance, that's another one, like managing situational things that come up. But I still stay rooted in that 3 core buckets. And I'll speak to me personally. I'm in my 30s still, just for a couple more weeks. But for me, it was saving on the retirement first. So that was, and by the way, retirement for saving first is as soon as possible, max out the 401k. After that was back to a Roth, which again, we've got whole commentary on what that is. But that's putting an additional $7,000 into an IRA, converting it to a Roth for both my wife and I. And then after that, it turned into the savings conduits of making sure my emergency fund stayed where I wanted it to be. That's changed. And candidly, as anyone who's had children knows, like the annual expense outlay changes as you add a new person into your household. And of course, some of the goals change related to it as well. But then next thing you know, it was, all right, the savings is getting above where it needs to be. Let's start flipping it over into brokerage accounts. And, in our case, we didn't necessarily have like a definitive thing that we were wanting for. I just knew that we didn't need it right now. And so I was okay taking risk. Now, I'll then transition and talk to our clients, because I'm not at deaccumulation phase, neither are you. But when we talk about a client that's getting closer and closer and closer to the life event of retirement or deaccumulating, for them, obviously it's an emotional decision, but as well as financial. But this is where now we have to look at whatever your nest egg is that you've accumulated. How do we turn that into a cash flow strategy? And it's fascinating because a lot of the discussions get centered around how are we keeping pace with the market? Are we beating the S&P? And I don't want to be cavalier about it, but candidly, when someone moves into deaccumulation mode, that is not the goal. Our goal is, are we able to achieve the cash flow needs that you have? Are your risks aligned with long-term incentives? And this is why, as we move into the deaccumulation phase, those buckets, that short-term, that intermediate, and long-term buckets, they start to shift in terms of what's in them. And that's all predicated on someone's risk profile. For example, I have an ultra-conservative client who, when he retired, he and his wife retired, we actually moved 5 years worth of their living expenses into the short-term bucket. Whereas while they were working and they had income, we only had 6 months. But that was a big move where, because of that respective risk profile, we moved it up. And candidly, that was probably one of the best things that we've done for that household, because as we've had market volatility, it's allowed him to stay very rooted, not getting emotional, and not really forcing other decisions that could be financially devastating long term. And then from there, so we had the short-term bucket, which is really designed for income and cash flow. Then the intermediate tranche, once we're in the deaccumulation phase, is really designed around generating income. So it's dividend-paying stocks, it's corporate bonds, structured notes, things of that nature, where we're producing income and cash flow that are helping replenish what we're drawing off that first tranche. And again, risk profile predicates this. In that same household that I just mentioned, we put 10 years worth of their income needs into that. And no, that's not enough income to fully offset what they're drawing. But again, this is a 60-year-old individual. We don't need all of their savings in short-term and intermediate term. So it allowed us to put the rest of it in long-term oriented goals. And that's the stuff, in their case, we have 15 years worth of coverage before they're even going to need to touch the long-term stuff. We haven't had a market environment where 15 years where it's been down. We haven't. I mean, statistically speaking, the best thing an investor can do is keep invested. We know that. If you look at the S&P 500, on any given 1 year, you have a 73% chance of making money. Mm-hmm. It's not 100. It's not 50-50. It's actually, I'd take those odds. But if you look at it over a 5-year period of time, you have 97.4% chance of making money. So the point being is staying invested is absolutely the best. And that's why those longer term buckets absolutely need to stay longer term in nature. And I'll come back to my comment I made earlier of, if your risk profile hasn't changed, your time horizon haven't changed, then your investment thesis should not change either. Mm-hmm. And that's one where I would tell you that as best we possibly can, it's very important, coming back to just our topic today, to recognize that those buckets need to be associated with where we're taking that risk. So like, for example, long-term monies, the Roths are presumably money that in most individuals' cases, if they have excess that's going to go to their kids, it should be in the Roths. Mm-hmm. That should be invested as aggressive or growth-oriented as that household can tolerate. My personal opinion, of course. But then it becomes a conversation of the segmentation of the buckets before then. I like the idea of maintaining non-qualified assets or brokerage assets to help us with tax payments, to help us with surprise cash outlays, anything that just kind of comes up. But that doesn't mean that we need to be keeping, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in these accounts. It's just an amount, right? And we can help manage tax efficiency between now and then, and use that as an opportunity to really optimize the portfolio along the way. Yep. So I know we've talked a lot about this, and we're probably getting towards the end of our podcast here, but let's talk about the conclusions and takeaways from this. What have you learned? What do you want to make sure that our audience has learned?
I'd say some key things that I've seen that are kind of stay true across the board, whether we're talking about accumulators or deaccumulators, is it's key to have your short-term savings adequate so that you can stay invested long-term. I think that applies to both the accumulators and the deaccumulators.
Agree completely.
For me, I want to have my emergency fund set ready to go. That way, if anything happens, I can afford it and I can keep my money working in the brokerage account. For somebody that's retired, like you said, you're subject to the market fluctuations at that point. You want to have your year, 2 year, or even up to 5 years, like you said, cash flow taken care of so that you're not subject to the market. I think another key takeaway that I'm getting from this is it's important to have lifestyle goals, not money goals. I think it's very easy for people to get caught up in having a certain dollar amount that I want to have in this account, certain dollar amount that I want to have in that account. I think it's really important to take a step back and say, what do I want my life to look like? And then let the money be the tool to work towards that and make it a reality. And then other than that, I think that a good way to wrap it up would be just where you're saving is just as important as how much you're saving.
Oh, absolutely. And understanding that optimization, which I think is just not educated on enough. And that's really part of the hope that we have with doing even these podcasts, but even today. It's like making sure that you're getting aligned. And I think it all comes back to that fundamental point of have a plan. It's never too early to have a financial plan, and for any of our clients that their children might not have engaged with an advisor yet, that's part of our offering. I would say that it's a very big part of anyone's success in their longevity is to be able to have that alignment very, very early on. We know the impact that we can make by having that conversation when someone's in their 20s and early 30s, which can be logarithmic when we wait and then all of a sudden they're in their 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. So, Grayson, thanks for the time today. It was a great podcast. Appreciate it.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks. The previous presentation by Bogart Wealth was intended for general information purposes only. No portion of the presentation serves as the receipt of or as a substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart Wealth or any other investment professional of your choosing. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that future performance of any specific investment or investment strategy or any other non-investment related or planning services, discussion, or content will be profitable, be suitable for your portfolio or individual situation, or prove successful. Neither Bogart Wealth's investment advisor registration status nor any amount of prior experience or success should be construed that a certain level of results or satisfaction will be achieved if Bogart Wealth is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Bogart Wealth is neither a law firm nor accounting firm, and no portion of its services shall be construed as legal or accounting advice. No portion of the podcast content should be construed by a client or prospective client as a guarantee that he or she will experience a certain level of results if Bogart Wealth is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Copies of Bogart Wealth's current written disclosure brochure and Form CRS discussing our advisory services and fees are available upon request or at www.bogartwealth.com.